Society of Otolaryngology-Head and Neck Surgery, Dr. Derek Birt, President, 1993-1994. This may be the first time it was used in anger, and hopefully he won't mind an ophthalmologist using it. So ladies and gentlemen, friends and family, thank you for being here today with Peter and me as we celebrate the lives of our parents, Anne and Derek Birt. We're delighted that Dad's two younger siblings were able to arrange to be here, David and Gillian. Thank you. Please continue to enjoy the refreshments. While afternoon tea itself was not a regular feature of our parents' lives, smoked salmon sandwiches and champagne and chocolate definitely were. I can't remember a holiday meal at their house that didn't feature at least one bottle of champagne chosen by Dad, so we're serving some of that today. Smoked salmon, either as an hors d'oeuvre on bread or lox on bagel, was another regular. Every sale pass that I can remember, as far back as I go, he would get up early to go and buy Greif's bagels and make a smoked salmon bagel for everyone coming. He lathered on cream cheese and pepper on every bagel, except mine. I didn't care for the pepper very much, which I thought he used too heavy a hand, so he would leave one plain, carefully marked with a bit of paper to indicate which it was. Chocolate, on the other hand, was more of a daily requirement. When we were younger, Peter and I, chocolate was a treat, usually supplied as after suppers. But it didn't take long before really it was an expected finish to the meal, and it stayed that way till the end of their lives. Mum used to claim that chocolate staved off Alzheimer's, and she was determined to continue to research this idea. Her preferred treat in later years was the Ferrero Rocher, known in the family as Roches, as in, would you like another Roches? Yes, please. And you see them in the large bowl. Please take a few in her memory. Both Peter and I will say a few words in tribute to our parents, and we have some memories for their friends who could not be here today, which we will read out. Michael Gordon and Peter Alberti will be sharing some thoughts as well, and it's our hope that many of you will have a memory or a tribute to share and will come up to the microphone later. Since I claimed the elder's prerogative and started, I will pass the microphone to Peter for his words.
It's actually switched off.
Well, could you hear me anyway? Okay. Would you like me to say that all again?
Okay, the mic is the wrong height for me. This is the problem when you have children of different heights. Those of you who are still hoping to have children, try to have children of the same height for this sort of. There we go.
Is that high enough?
Yeah, that's good. Thanks, Uncle David. Having an engineer in. It's just turned. Oh yeah, here we are. I was going to say having an engineer in the family can be help at times like this. So, hello everyone. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it very much. And as you all know, we are celebrating the lives of both Anne and Derek today, which is I realize it's a little bit unusual, but this is the way things have worked out. And their lives were very overlapped very closely in many ways. They were born 2 weeks to the day from each other, and they died a little bit more than 7 months after the other. And they had a very long, happy life together. And so we're celebrating them both here at the same time. They were both were born before the war, and they both lived through the Second World War as children, had slightly different experiences. My mother was from a slightly more well-to-do family, and she was evacuated along with her mother, my grandmother, and her two sisters to the West Indies after the outbreak of the war. And she told me one story once. There was on the ship sailing across the Atlantic to the West Indies, and there was a lifeboat drill, and so everyone was wearing these huge cork life jackets for the drill, and her two younger sisters were very young, and they found that if they could run at each other really fast, they could bump into each other and fall down backwards on the deck without hurting each other because of all this bulky cork they were wearing. So they had a great time doing that, and my mom she told me she felt very left out because she was the oldest one, had to be responsible and couldn't play this game, and she felt kind of, left out of jealous because all these like really tough sailors on the ship were like watching this and melting with these two like adorable children playing this really funny game, and my mom couldn't join in, so that was one memory she had, but. It all worked out well. They all survived the war in complete safety, and her father, my grandfather, had a very good job during the war. In peacetime, he was a banker. During the war, he was a paymaster, so he was doing a very important function, keeping the troops paid while well away from the shooting himself, as far as I could tell. I ain't descended from no fools. My dad, on the other hand, lived in England throughout the war, and his father was a surgical officer in the Royal Navy. And one of the stories that my father told me about that time was he remembers they were living at that time in Portsmouth, which was not one of the main centers of the German bombing, but was bombed. He told me that he remembered being driven in a car by his father to school, I think the story was, with his brother. And my dad remembered the car going bump, bump, bump over the fire hoses laid across the road for fighting the fires from the bombing the night before. So they both experienced the war in different ways, but not in any really first-hand way. In fact, I think my Uncle David has another story from that time, which I have known about, but I'll leave it to him to tell that one, because I stole the one about the fire hoses, which he was going to tell. So, Katie is going to talk about the influences that our parents had on her, and I guess they influenced her more than they influenced me. They did influence me with their love of classical music, and I can certainly remember two great pieces of music that I've known all my life. I can remember for as long as I've lived. It's Piano Concerto No. 23 by Mozart, and the Piano Concerto No. 5 by Beethoven, which is commonly known as the Emperor Concerto. Remember those for as long as I've lived. Fantastic music. If you like classical music and you've never heard those before, especially the Mozart, which might be a little bit less known than the Beethoven, as I say, if you like classical music, do yourself a favor and listen to it sometime. It's really great. But I think the biggest influence I would say they've had on me was they were incredibly kind people, and it's not for me to say that I'm a kind person too. That's for you to judge and to say. But I, as an adult, I am really impressed by what I saw, the way they treated everybody. I saw them interact with many people over the course of their lives, rich and not so much, important and not so much, and they treated them all equally with great respect and dignity, and I am really proud of them for that. And as I say, they modeled this behavior for me. I saw it every day for years and years and years. I try to be that way. Again, whether I'm successful is not really for me to say, but that is their biggest influence on me. I have one last small anecdote. It's not the funniest story you've ever heard, but it's a very vivid memory for me. 30 years ago, my mother turned 60, and her birthday was on a Saturday, and my dad arranged for a dinner out at Scaramouche, which was one of the finest restaurants in Toronto at the time, and maybe it still is. I don't know if it's still open. Still is. Yeah, there we are. And what my mom didn't know was that one of her sisters, Jenny, was coming to Toronto that day with her husband. I think it was for a business trip for her husband. And so we organized like a surprise for them to join us, to come to our house and join us and have dinner with us, which she didn't know. So the day came, and it was a Saturday afternoon, and she was listening to the Metropolitan Opera broadcast of Die Walküre, which was one of her favorite operas. And before the opera ended, Jenny and Richard arrived from the airport, and we were able to get them into the house without her realizing she was engrossed in the opera. And so we hid them off in a side room and waited for the end of the opera, because it was the last act of Die Walküre and some of my mom's favorite music. And so it came to the climax with the if you know the opera, the magic fire, or Brunhilde gets put to sleep. If Wotan is singing about the hero, Siegfried, who's going to come and wake her up in the next opera. And so she adored this music, so we just sat there in rapture until we let it finish. And eventually it sort of finished, and the last chords died away. And over the broadcast, you could hear like the Met crowd cheering, clapping. So that was that. At that point, my Auntie Jenny, her sister, jumped into the living room. Hi, Anne, happy birthday! And the shock, the surprise, was complete. Her jaw like down by her knees. Complete surprise, complete shock, and so the six of us went to have dinner at Scaramouche that night, and it was a fantastic evening, one of the best dinners I can ever remember having. So those are that's a very vivid memory of mine. As I said, not the funniest story you've ever heard, but a very vivid memory of mine, and I think I have the music to Walking Home, a lot of operas on my iPhone. I think I've never really associated that music with my mom until now, but thinking about that story, I think I will think about that music when I think about my mom for the rest of my life. And I know I can play that music and be thinking about her because I know she loved it. So, are you coming up now? Yeah. So Katie is going to. So I'll give you her thoughts about life with Mom and Dad.
Thank you, Peter. Obviously, a lot of the memories I have of our parents are in common with Peter, but there are a few things that perhaps I can share. I don't know how most father-daughter relationships are, but I had a lovely one with Dad. As most of you probably know, I spent many years sailing with him, including years on the racing crew of Moringa, the CNC 30 that was his most successful boat. I reached out to as many of the crew from that time as I could, but sadly none of them were able to be here today. Dad was a very good racing skipper, generally cool and disinclined to yell or swear. Rory Fisher, who reminded me of the story, which was before my time, of how on a tight race with another boat, Dad went aground. This catastrophe was acknowledged by him with the immortal words, "Oh dear." For those who don't sail, this incident would usually be greeted by several very different four-letter words. Rory said that the two Swedes who were on the crew rocked the boat off the bottom successfully once they'd stopped laughing. My position on the boat was on the foredeck. And most crew taking that position are large, imposing guys and are generally referred to as foredeck gorillas. Dad would introduce me to people as his foredeck bush baby. Later in life, I got into medical school, a fact that I believe pleased them both. I was never directly taught by either of them, but they had good advice nonetheless. Mum recommended that I wear a watch with a second hand for taking pulses. Once I started practice, Dad had two important pieces of advice. The first, never get behind on your dictation. Nowadays, of course, less is dictated than before, but letting paperwork, whether physical or virtual, get out of control is still a mistake. The other point was more profound. He said to me, "You're going to have complications and poor outcomes," and he was right. He said, "You're not going to want to see those patients, but those are the ones you must see." He was right again. I have tried to pass on this particular piece of wisdom to the residents and fellows that I train now, because it's critical. Some of Mum's influence was more domestic. She taught me that there is no lovelier sound than that of a dishwasher running. And having help in the house was a wonderful thing. She also taught me to cook. She herself hadn't learned much about that during her upbringing, but after getting married, she took some lessons, bought cookbooks, and figured it out. When we were kids, the evening meal was generally based on the day of the week. As I recall, it was pork chops on Monday, cold cuts on Tuesday after shopping, fish on Wednesday, chicken for Thursday, and steak on Friday. Saturdays were a bit variable, and Sunday was often a roast of some kind. Her Thanksgiving and Christmas meals were unbeatable. I've taken over those holidays several years ago now, and I can't match what she did. My menus are much simpler. When I was older, I helped her, of course, but mostly by reading the recipe as she did the work. Homemade marmalade was something she did annually, and I've never tried that. It looks far too difficult. Homemade Christmas pudding, though, I do. The puddings we had last December were the first ones that Mum and Dad hadn't stirred, even briefly, as we made them. A lot of my taste in colour and decoration was drawn from Mum. She loved clear Scandinavian glass and furniture, and the colour combination green and blue. She liked paisley prints. The shirt I'm wearing today was one she liked. Every time I wore it, she asked if I would give it to her. She introduced me to many of her favourite authors, including Jane Austen and Dick Francis. Every year, she gave the latest Dick Francis to Dad for his Christmas present, and read it on Boxing Day herself. Another thing she said only once stayed with me. I don't remember the context, but she suddenly said, "I don't care who you bring home, as long as he's intelligent." She had definite priorities. But it wasn't just the household stuff we did together. Back in the day, I worked at the Baycrest Terrace one summer as a candy striper. Mum had a small general practice among the residents, and I was able to see how much she was appreciated by the people there, particularly including the nurses. Later, for a few years, I held an associate position at Baycrest myself, doing eye examinations. We met for lunch every Friday when I went, and when people figured out that I was Dr. Birt's daughter, they never failed to tell me how wonderful she was, and I agreed with them. Both of them loved cats. Our first cat, Pansy, was flown over with the family when we emigrated. Freddie joined us later. He was a street cat and wandered around the neighbourhood without a home. Mum said that if he was still around when we got back from our summer holidays, we would take him in. He was, and we did. Later on, we found out that the neighbours had heard of this offer and had taken great care to feed him on our back patio while we were gone. After Pansy died, Fred we lost on the road, sadly, we got two more. We went to a rescue, and on the way there, Mum said, "I'm going to have to look after this cat. We are getting one." But I liked Nancy, and Peter chose Charlie, so we went home with two. They were a great team. When they met, Dad had a driver's license, and Mum had access to a car. Dad had records, and Mum had a player, so clearly it was meant to be. However, they did argue at times. Mum was always a bit unhappy when she was on call, and Dad and I went blithely off sailing. And it was acknowledged they didn't really work together well. There's a story that they nearly divorced, back when they were papering the nursery for me. I don't remember it, but I'm told that I added to the stress by sitting quietly while they were working in the bathroom, putting an entire box of tissue paper into the toilet. So they mostly had their own spheres of influence and work within the family. When we went on car trips, however, he drove and she navigated, and it was seamless. They also shared, as Peter has said, a love of opera and classical music, of reading and cats, and I'm glad to say of their children. Together, they gave us a wonderful childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, and life overall. We miss them. So I would like now to pass the podium over to David Birt, Dad's younger brother, who is here from England.
Right, good afternoon, everyone. And it's very nice to be over here from England. As Katie has just said, I am Derek's brother. He was my eldest brother. Have I got that the right way around? He was my eldest brother. Right. So I am very proud and honoured to be here this afternoon to tell you a little bit about particularly his early life. Derek was always 10 years older than me. Very sadly, that's why we're here really, very sadly, I'm now catching him up, aren't I? But we're not here for sadness, we're here to remember and celebrate good lives. Derek and Anne. I'd like to give my apologies, or the apologies of my wife, Brenda, who's remained at home back in England, because she has great mobility problems and didn't think she could cope with a long flight like this. So apologies from her. I happen to be the family historian, and just for amusement really, the wrong end, but if you unroll that, I can't see from back to front, but let's see. All, 5 of us here today are on this.
Somewhere.
Yeah, somewhere. Derek is there, and my brother Michael is there, I am there, and Sister Gillian is there. So that's been quite a few years of my life trying to work that out.
Well done.
So, Derek, as you know, was born on the 20th of March 1933, and his brother followed 18 months later. However, they were christened Brian Derek and Alan Michael. Family folklore does not recount why their names were swapped around. I've looked into this, but can't find in it that it was anything to do with their initials spelling something inappropriate or risque. Sadly, I never did ask Derek for his views on the matter, but Michael, just a few weeks ago, told me that it caused him no end of bother, especially when filling in official forms. Think about that. So, our grandfather Henry Birt, he was a chemist, and he had wanted his eldest son, Carlton, who later changed his name to Charles. He wanted father to carry on the chemist's business. "No," said the son. "I'm not going to do that. I want to go to sea," he said. But he agreed that he would become a doctor first. And so straight after qualifying in 1928, he joined the Royal Navy as a surgeon lieutenant. Carlton duly married Mona Rowe in 1931. At the time of Derek's birth, which was 17 months after that auspicious marriage, he was serving at the Royal Marines Infirmary in Portsmouth and living nearby in Southsea. But his mother, that's Derek's mother, returned to the family roots for the birth at the Claremont Nursing Home in Handsworth, Birmingham, as she did for the birth of brother Michael 18 months later. The Navy posted father to Malta twice in the 1930s, and mother, with Derek and a nanny, and later Michael, set up home there and enjoyed a happy 3 years. There was one potentially disastrous moment, however, when baby Derek thought he could swim. Father had taken him out to a raft anchored offshore, and whilst father was looking the other way, he'd managed to get off the raft, and when father spotted him, he was well underwater. But luckily, father was able to retrieve him, and there were no ill effects. Well, maybe there were, but I'm not aware what they were. Other postings and family moves followed, leading to Surgeon Lieutenant Commander Birt, as he then was, being posted to the 1-year-old cruiser HMS Sheffield, quite a famous ship in naval circles, and that was in August 1938. Now, an exciting moment for the 2 young boys occurred in May 39, and that was possibly on Derek's 6th birthday, when the ship was anchored in Weymouth Bay off the coast of Dorset. They were taken out to the ship in a naval launch and were able to go on board and have a tour of the ship, including their father's cabin, which they thought was very small. 4 months later, of course, the country was at war with Germany. And Derek and Michael were not to see their father again for the next 2 years, apart from one very quick trip to Scotland when the ship, the Sheffield, was docked there for maintenance. The war quickly led to Mother following many other families in evacuating their families to perceived safer areas of the country. Obviously, the South Coast, Portsmouth, and these other ports were obviously key enemy targets. So the Birt family moved to grandfather's chemist shop in Devizes in Wiltshire. And Derek and Michael enjoyed themselves exploring all the chemical stores down in the cellar and other goodies and so on. And apparently this was much to grandfather's annoyance. They walked each day to school, but in due course the family moved again to Birmingham to stay with the other grandparents, the Rose. Derek and Michael had in fact found grandfather Birt rather austere and best avoided, whilst they got on much better with grandfather Rowe. However, having got to Birmingham, they discovered it was not so safe after all, because that became a major target of bombing, and there were intense raids. Derek's memories of the war there cover gas masks. We got a picture of the two boys carrying their gas masks, air raid shelters dug in the garden, searchlights, fires everywhere, the sound of falling bombs, and being boys collecting bomb fragments for their trophies, being woken up by a bomb which blew a wooden shutter on top of Derek one night. Luckily, he didn't himself get any injury from that. They used to one day they walked to school and found a bomb had landed right opposite and blown out all the windows in the school. I think they enjoyed missing a day's school because they had to go right back home again. By the November, things had got so hot, particularly after 9 hours of continuous bombing one night, that Grandpa Rowe moved the family to Kidderminster, which is just a little outside the city and somewhat more peaceful. Then in June 1941, Father, now Surgeon Commander, was posted as a bacteriologist to the Royal Naval Hospital in Plymouth, and the family moved to Pomfret, a village just east of the city. Although Plymouth was also the target of very heavy bombing, being a major naval port, Pomfret itself was peaceful, apart from the excitement one day when a barrage balloon came adrift and crashed down into the garden, where the rabbits were kept. Family kept rabbits there to supplement their food ration. History doesn't tell me what happened to the rabbits. No doubt eaten in due course. The two boys went to school in Plymouth, either by train or tram, occasionally having to walk. Once again, they were witness to most extensive bomb damage, and they used to look out at the fires lighting up the horizon. In due course, during this period, Father decided the family needed a break. So they all went off to a resort called Loo, which is about 20 miles to the west. Thing is, they cycled there, all of them, including young Derek and Michael. I don't know that they had a very good beach holiday there, because all the beaches in southern England were heavily out of bounds and covered with barbed wire during that period. Another incident there whilst in Plymouth was that one day they were on bicycles close to a beach, and a German plane came over and seemed to be intent on strafing them. They pedalled as hard as they could and got away. Now, it's during this time that I joined the family, July 43, when Derek was aged 10. Now, just 2 months after my birth, our father was posted to India and later Ceylon on the staff of Admiral Louis Mountbatten with the rank of Surgeon Captain. And once again, there was a lengthy spell of absence from the family. Derek and Michael were enrolled in Seafield Park Boarding School, which had extensive grounds set in remote and beautiful countryside on the edge of the Dartmoor National Park. I've been there to have a look at it to see if I could find any written records of the school. I did get one year magazine which did mention their names. Can't quite remember what for, but they were definitely there. So this school had been evacuated to there from near Portsmouth, because the original school was commandeered by the Admiralty. So this new school was in fact the home of the Dukes of Bedford. Here the boys enjoyed considerable freedom and quite lax discipline, but they worked hard, and Derek and Michael inevitably spent much less time together. And after 3 years there, Derek gained an exhibition scholarship to Epsom College of Royal Medical Foundation in Surrey, near London. Father's war had ended in Southeast Asia with the surrender of the Japanese, and he was posted back to England to several naval establishments over the next 4 years. And he established a new family home in Emsworth on the south coast of Hampshire. Sister Gillian, over there, was born in this house in 1946. Then, in 1949, our father retired from the Navy due to a war injury. His whole eardrum had to be removed. He became a general practitioner in the brand new National Health Service, and the family moved to Woolston Lodge in Southampton, to a house which contained the surgery. So Derek was a boarder at Epsom College until 1951, and apart from his undoubted academic skills, he distinguishes himself playing hockey for the school and, apparently, throwing the javelin. He gained entry to University College Hospital, known to most people as UCH, to study medicine. And at that time, I started my boarding life, following on in the footsteps of both Derek and Michael at the same schools. While still an undergraduate, Derek was found to be suffering from tuberculosis, and he spent several months, possibly a year, I haven't got that date actually pinned down, but he certainly spent a long time in a sanatorium at Midhurst in Surrey. To relieve his boredom, he started studying the horse racing form, with, I believe, some success in placing small bets. There you go. Don't know whether he followed that hobby up in later life. Didn't hear any more about it. My memories of the 1950s include Christmases and 10 traditional English seaside family holidays, 5 of which included Derek. Father's Christmas presents for Derek and Michael were invariably £10 each. One time in coins, another time in an apparently empty envelope, which after considerable study was found to have in very faint writing on the inside of the envelope, "I owe you £5." And another time this present was in a large cardboard box full of screwed up paper. And I can certainly remember, I can visualise them tearing the paper up, searching, unfolding all this screwed up paper, throwing the whole lot out in disgust because they couldn't find anything. But somewhere hidden in there was £5. And for Gillian and I, it was great fun watching the brothers trying to find their hidden presents while she and I sat in bed with Mother and Father. The first of the summer holidays I mentioned was in 1950 at Lyme Regis on the Dorset coast. Famous for a lady called Mary Anning, who was really the founder of paleontology and discovered the first Jurassic dinosaurs. And it's also the location for such films as The French Lieutenant's Woman. Does that mean anything? Our transport to Lyme Regis for that holiday was rather over the top. The distance between Southampton and Lyme Regis was about 90 miles. So Father took me in his car. Mother took Gillian in her car. That's Mother's car, not Gillian's car. Michael went on his bicycle, and Derek was on his Triumph motorbike, EBK 107. So we've got a photograph of that motorbike. He was very, very keen on that. 1953 saw us at Newquay on the North Cornwall coast, now famous, probably internationally famous for its surfing competitions. From here we made a day trip to Land's End, which is the nearest point in England to Canada. There you have it. I took a family group photograph there, which I've noticed appears on this revolving display, because it's quite famous in the family, because it makes the whole lot look as if they'd just come up from a coal mine. Now, it may have been whilst at Newquay that Derek tried his hands at lawn bowling, which was a favourite sport at that time of our father, a sport which I followed using my father's bowls. Not sure whether Derek followed that one up. 1955 saw Derek with us at Tenby on the Welsh coast. And then in 1956 at Sandown on the Isle of Wight. Father then bought a caravan, and in 1958 Derek joined us at the famous beauty spot of Durdle Door on the Dorset coast. Pictures advertising holidays in England often show this famous spot with a rock looking like a sort of dragon leaping out and over the sea. Mother, Father, Gillian, and the new family member, Rusty the Golden Retriever, slept in the caravan, whilst Derek and I resided in 2 small hike tents set side by side on the headland. One day, Rusty, the dog, unfortunately gashed his leg on a metal bar on the beach, left quite a trail of blood as the poor dog limped back up the very steep hill. father, and most probably Derek assisting, took the dog off to a vet for the wound to be stitched. It may have been the previous year, I'm not quite sure whether I've got this right, but 1 year about this time, Derek thoroughly enjoyed the experience of working for part of the summer as a waiter in a hotel at Clacton-on-Sea on the Essex coast. I can well remember him demonstrating his newly acquired skill carrying a large number of plated servings on his arm. 6 of them, I think. By now, I think we got up to 1957, Derek had qualified as a doctor, and he held a number of posts at several London hospitals before, in due course, moving to the Middlesex Hospital in 1965 as a senior registrar, having gained his fellowship exams in 1962, aiming to become a consultant. It so happened that also working at the Middlesex was another newly qualified, very attractive young doctor by the name of Anne Weymouth Deeks. She was exactly, as you've already been told, a fortnight younger than Derek. She had 2 sisters, one of whom also became a doctor. I don't know who eyed up whom first, but apparently romance soon blossomed. And the next, or possibly even the first I knew anything about it, was the announcement of an engagement, to be followed by a lovely wedding on Saturday, 9th of July, 1960. I certainly remember that. One of the bridesmaids was Gillian, another one was Anne's sister. Michael was the best man, and I was one of the 4 ushers. And Anne looked really stunning. And you'll have seen some of the photographs in the display on the wall there. The reception was held in a large marquee on the Deeks' back lawn. Now, how apt was it that the happy couple should choose to live at number 7 Lovers Walk, Finchley? And how apt, too, that the front garden, I remember well, was awash with forget-me-not flowers. In due course, Catherine joined the world, 21st March 1962, and then Peter completed the family, 5th of November 1963. For some years, family holidays were spent in the New Forest at the thatched cottage Brockenhurst, which was due to become the retirement home of our mother and father in 1966. And we've got 8mm film of Derek supervising his children in their running races around and round the outside of the cottage. Derek clearly in his element there, supervising. Get ready, go. And off they ran. So it's all on film. In due course, Derek was offered a consultancy at Sunnybrook Hospital here in Toronto, and he and the family, plus their cat, emigrated 28th of April 1970. And within a matter of days, they'd set up their home, 109 Lawrence Crescent. Now, I was aghast to learn that Derek's hard-earned fellowship of the Royal College of Surgeons, which he gained in 1962, did not apparently cut the mustard here in Canada, and so he successfully sat the Canadian equivalent in 1971. I'm only glad I never had to face a similar re-examination myself. Inevitably, the pressures of lives and careers, coupled with the great distance between us, has meant that I did not get to see Derek and Anne so much over the coming decades. I only managed to get to Toronto twice before today. Firstly in 1978, when, for one race, I was part of the crew in Derek's yacht, My Ringer. Lake Ontario was sheathed in fog, which may be common, but anyway, Derek was, you know how determined he was to do anything, determined to get on and try and win the race. And my job was to crouch as far forward as possible, listening for the clanging bell of the next buoy that we got to go round. Meanwhile, my own family were enjoying a day of glorious sunshine at Toronto Zoo. My second visit was in 2002 for Peter's wedding to Norris, when my son Martin was an usher. Gillian had at one time stayed with Derek and Anne for 2 weeks, 1974 she tells me, but then in 1976 she too emigrated to Canada, starting in Toronto, but pushing on westwards as far as she could go, i.e. Vancouver, which is where she still lives, but we're very nice to see her here again today. Derek and Anne made the occasional foray back to England for holidays and a number of family events. I particularly remember their last such visit, June 2009, taking them to quite a famous local edifice, Wimborne Minster, which has an impressive clock. In fact, I think there's one outside and one inside. And of course, Derek, being Derek, was very keen to take photographs. We also went to the glorious National Trust estate at Kingston Lacey, not too far away from there. Derek and Michael's formative years were obviously deeply influenced by the Navy, or by the naval and medical ways of life, and the impact of World War II. Now, it's interesting to reflect that as far as I know, Derek had no desire to follow his father into the Navy, but happily became a doctor, whilst Michael had set his heart on the Navy, only to be turned down on medical grounds. He'd suffered a rugby injury when at school, and he spent the best part of a year encased in a special jacket to try and get his spine sorted out. Eventually had a major operation on it. But then Derek became the keen sailor whilst at medical school, whilst Michael then embarked on a new career to become a doctor. So, pretty twist around there. I personally was banned from entering the medical profession when my father said to me when I was a teenager, "I have sent 2 sons to medical school, I am not sending a third." This suited me, as I was rather prone to faint at the sight of blood. "Why don't you become a civil engineer like his favourite cousin?" And so I did. Derek was lucky to be blessed with a first-class brain, and he certainly put it to good use, carving out a highly successful medical career. I always looked up to my eldest brother with admiration and pride. He tended to dominate any gathering, certainly social family gatherings, and he was also certainly a great organizer. Others can probably tell me whether that applies to his work as well. As Michael said to me 2 months ago, Derek was always the one with ideas. Derek was blessed too with a happy and long marriage with 2 lovely children. Anne was a delightful person, very kind. Generally, we found quite quiet and happy to let Derek be the leader, whilst continuing her own medical career at Bayview Hospital here in Toronto. So, brief summary of Derek's life there for you, early stages anyway, and I hope we hear some bit more about his actual medical career.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, David. That was a lot of many things I'd never heard before in my life. So thank you very much. So both Anne and Derek were the oldest of their siblings, and my dad is survived by all his siblings. Unfortunately, our mother, even though she was the oldest of hers, she outlived her two siblings, so there are no siblings from her side of the family at this event. Unfortunately, if there had been, they would have been more than welcome. Some of you have kindly agreed to come up here and give remarks of your own about our parents, and I'd like to, at this point to invite Dr. Michael Gordon, who has agreed to come and speak about Anne Birt, with whom he worked for many years at Baycrest Hospital. Thank you very much. Thanks, Michael.
Well, I'm going to speak a bit about Anne and a bit about Derek, and it's been an honor to participate in this event. Anne actually had a very profound influence on my life, because when I came to Canada, I had been living in Israel, and I came initially for some training in nuclear medicine, which after about an hour, for those who know me, I realized it wasn't for me because you didn't talk to anybody. But I stuck it out for a year, and then I ended up going to Mount Sinai Hospital to be chief resident, and somebody pointed me to the opportunity to perhaps do geriatrics, which I trained in Scotland, which was recognized and one of the best rotations I ever had. When I heard about it, I thought, gee, that would be very interesting. So when I was offered the position at Mount Sinai, I asked the then chief of medicine, Dr. Barney Barris, if I would be allowed to participate in Baycrest, and he said, sure. So I did the consultations for people who came for Baycrest and vice versa. Well, the first interview I had at Baycrest, I was taken around, and I was taken to this room, and there was this woman sitting there in a white, standing in a white coat next to a bed, and I was introduced to Dr. Anne Birt. And as soon as she opened her mouth, I thought, oh, a Brit. Now, even though I studied in Scotland, I did understand English. And one of the things I learned in Scotland was never to mix up the two. Because on the first day when I said England instead of Scotland, one of the local Dundonians said, if you want to stay alive, you don't do that. So I learned. Anyway, I was so impressed with this doctor who, when I finally started working at Baycrest and Mount Sinai, she was one of the jewels of Baycrest. And we worked very closely together for many years. And I see some of the pictures up there which remind me. One of them is, I think, in the original acute care unit, 4CC, which she was the primary care physician and I was the consultant. I used to say, I didn't tell anybody at the time because OHIP would have done something about it. When Anne asked me for a consultation, we had a pink sheet that had, copy paper underneath. At the end of the consultation, I felt just like writing yes. Because what Anne had done was exactly, but you can't bill for a consultation for a yes. So I had to write this whole thing. For those who understand Yiddish, the word is a Megillah. That's the story, right, of Purim. So I worked with Anne very closely for many years, and I found her to be not only a delightful person, but a very, very capable physician. She was a marvelous teacher. The students, the trainees, we had in those good old days interns from Mount Sinai, adored her, as did all the staff. And even after she retired from Baycrest, at that time I was head of the ethics department program, and she volunteered to sit on our ethics committee. even though she was retired, and it was thoroughly enjoyable because she brought not only her wisdom and smarts, but a wonderful approach to humanity, because that's who she was. Derek entered my life because one day I don't know exactly where I met him, but he looked at me, he says, "Do you sail?" And I thought, well, I have sailed, meaning I have been in a sailboat once or twice in Scotland, where one of my professor of physiology was actually a New Zealand sailor. And he actually sailed from New Zealand to Britain in his own sailboat, right? And that sailboat is the one he had, for those who know Dundee, the Tay, right? The famous Tay Bridge disaster was the Tay. So he took me sailing, and that really was some sailing because it's a very rough bit of water. And then I spent a summer in Poland, and the people I worked with in the anatomy department, they said, and for those who know how you translate Polish into English, says, Michael, you know from sail? You know to sail? I said, yes, with the same thing I had sailed. So we went up to a place called, I can't remember the Lake District there, and we got a sailboat, and they had a great big rye bread, and they canned sardines. They sat on the boat, and they looked at me, and they said, "So, to sail." I said in my best English, "What mean you?" "You said to sail." And I explained that I had been sailing, but I didn't know how to sail. So between the four of us, we figured out in about an hour how to actually get this little sailboat out, because every time we did something, we ended up back where we started. We hadn't learned about tacking. Anyway, so my actually sailing experience was limited. So Derek asked me if I to sail. And I said, well, limited. He says, you'll come with us. So I went on this absolutely gorgeous boat, and I think it was the first time with Rory, if I'm not mistaken. And I knew Rory because we were in geriatrics. And I said basically to Derek, what do I do? He said, when I tell you to, just lean over the side and put your legs under this railing. And when I say lean, lean. And I had never done that because I'd never been in a race. And I remember the first time I did it, I thought, oh my God, you can die from this, right? That sounded like, to me like Brooklynese. You say, what does lethal mean? Is from this you can be dead. So I ended up being one of Derek's crew periodically, sometimes with Rory, sometimes with Anne. I don't think I ever went with you. I don't remember. But we did a few races, and after a while I learned how to really lean, and I didn't die, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. But the one thing I did learn from Derek, I once got called. He says, we're sailing this afternoon, can you go? And I said, they're calling for rain. Derek said, if I didn't sail, every time they called for rain in Toronto, I'd never sail. So we went out, and it didn't rain. Now, if you see one of the pictures of Anne in her white coat, I remember that place because I remember the picture in the back where it was taken. So for me, I have a wonderful association with the Birt family, including Katie, when she was considering medical school, and we had a long talk, and as a gift for my chatting with her, she gave me a mug. You went to Queen's, right?
Yes, I did.
From Queen's University. Well, giving me a mug for beer is a little bit of an oxymoron, but I still have it. It's very good for holding pencils and pens. And the last thing is, as Katie got into her ophthalmology, she once saved my eyes in that I was going, I think, to Israel, and I suddenly had something where I couldn't see, right? So I was going like 2 days later, and the only person I knew who I thought could see me quickly was Katie. She saw me, and I don't remember what it was, but she said it was nothing, and it was nothing, and I went on my trip. And the last thing is I have a buddy that I meet every Saturday for coffee, and we talk about, he was from Romania, he lived in Israel, this and that, and one day he was telling me about his eyes, and he said, I'm seeing this wonderful doctor at Sunnybrook. I said, who is that? And he said, Dr. Birt. And I said, you're in the best hands I know. And that is true. So for me, it's an absolute honor to be part of this and part of the Birt family. And I remember going into the house and hearing opera, and we often talked about opera. I wasn't quite as committed to going to the opera and listening to it, but I do have about 100 opera CDs. So thank you very much for inviting me. Unfortunately, I have to leave now because I'm driving to Detroit to visit my daughter who's studying there. So thank you very much for inviting me. And
Our next and final invited speaker is Dr. Peter Alberti, who will speak about his career with Dad.
The Birt family and friends, it's a privilege to be asked to speak today, as befits someone nearly as old as Derek. It's all typed out in large print. I first met Derek and Anne Birt when they came to Toronto in 1970 for Derek to be interviewed for a position at Sunnybrook Hospital. It was the depth of winter. Quite a shock for them, and as we were new, for us too. Nonetheless, we all went out tobogganing, and I have photographs of the four of us on sledges in Rosedale Golf Course, where one could still toboggan at the time. Nonetheless, he was recruited. The family moved to Toronto in the late spring of that year. They moved into a neighbourhood near us, and Derek and I overlapped at Sunnybrook for a whole 6 weeks before I moved. In this time, we took a daily lunchtime walk, a quaint practice we brought from England, and here we became firm friends. Since then, our lives have intertwined. Our children became friends. We've become, if I may say so, an extended family. We spent feast days together every Christmas since 1970 in the company of the Birt family, every Christmas, overwhelmingly hosted by Derek and Anne, but latterly by their daughter Katie, who's as mean a cook as she's good a surgeon. We enjoy it very much. Now, of the early years, I have a series of photographs of Derek carving a goose. I don't know why goose, but it was always 2 geese. Sometimes he had long hair, sometimes he had sideburns, sometimes he had short hair, but he was always Derek. Now, they were, in fact, a very private but devoted couple. I will not talk much about Anne, as Michael has done, Dr. Gordon's done that, except to say that she was an exceptional physician, extremely competent, enormously caring, but whose life was blighted for her last decades by a significant problem with her eyesight. In Anne's long final illness, she was increasingly dependent on Derek. When she died, Derek's last months were dominated by an overwhelming pining for her. They have 2 children, as by now you know, Katie and Peter, whom they loved and cherished. And today we see granddaughter Emily, who was a jewel in their lives. They were proud of their children and their achievements for good reason. Now, you've heard that Derek came from a medical naval family and his sibs were educated in England, that he attended University College Medical School in London. He was one of the diaspora from that institution who moved to Toronto in the late 1960s and early 70s. I think I once counted it. There were 20 graduates within a 2-year period from that rather small but elite medical school who landed up in Toronto. What a loss for England. What a gain for Toronto. He trained in otolaryngology at the Middlesex Hospital under the redoubtable Sir Douglas Ranger, where he learned the elements of head and neck surgery, something that was relatively unusual in otolaryngology at that time. Skills that he brought to Toronto. As a student, you heard, he learned to sail. And being a sailor, when I first bought a boat, I bought a boat and then some sailing lessons, didn't complete the lessons, and off we went on our first Tuesday evening club race. I recruited Derek, who was the only sailor I knew, to come and guide us round the harbour. Well, the wind dropped, the boat was small, the race was called, and the tender from the club race committee boat went round finishing boats. Finish, finish, finish. Then they came to ours and said, "He's not one of ours," and drove on. Next year, my motto was first. It was last by less the first year, and first or bust the second year. Now, as a student, I gather, Derek also took up flying in a Tiger Moth, which was a classic, understated, tough, safe, and unostentatious aeroplane, quite typical of its pilot. He was a great guy, or as he might have said, a good chap. He was well liked by patients, colleagues, and students, and he had the great attributes of a stellar teacher, listening, explaining, and never, or rather rarely, becoming impatient. His surgical trainees really loved him. He was a great and supportive colleague, always willing to lend a listening ear and to give sound advice when it was asked for. His career at Sunnybrook and the University of Toronto followed an upwards trajectory. Initially appointed as an assistant professor, he rose through the ranks to full professor and took on the challenging position of program director for the Department of Otolaryngology, in charge of all the trainees who were going to become many of Canada's best otolaryngologists. He fulfilled this position with distinction and complete integrity. As an aside, I believe this to be the most important post in a clinical department. He took decisions that were necessary, but he was neither confrontational nor judgmental when dealing with people problems, an important part of the job. He thus gained the full trust of his trainees and his colleagues, a difficult balancing act with that position. He was an innovative clinician, collaborating with Professor Jimmy Main to create a very successful clinic for diseases of the mouth, which they ran for many years, something which at that time was new in Toronto. He became editor of the Journal of Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery in 1982, a position he filled with distinction for some years. And he was president of the Canadian Society of Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery, where he proved to be a safe pair of hands during a time of professional turbulence. He guided the society well. Derek was a man of total integrity, never seeking the limelight, and a great support for his colleagues, in particular Julian Dzelski and myself. Always a good man from whom to seek advice, a cool head and a quiet voice of reason. I certainly was most thankful to him for listening when I needed someone to talk to and for advising me when I needed advice. But not all was work. He and Anne loved opera, which they attended in Toronto and in other cities, including going down to the Met and I believe getting lost coming out of it one night, with great pleasure, and when not live, listening to favourite performances on CD while reading in their comfortable Lawrence Park home, a place of which I have happy memories. True to his naval roots, he collected antique barometers, of which he had a large collection. These all with mercury. And this was the days before mercury was forbidden on an aeroplane. I believe the airlines are scared it'll spill and metal will run around, causing all sorts of short circuits. Anyway, couldn't transport them on planes anymore, and that was the end of that hobby. But much more than this, as you heard, he was an avid sailor and then golfer. He took great pleasure in his yacht Moringa, which he raced locally with great verve. Then, true to his love of things classical, he next purchased a wooden 8-meter yacht. This is a class of sailing vessels, many of which are in Toronto, which, and many of, like his, were built in the 1930s and 20s. I'm not sure whether his yacht was older than he. I think it was. So there he is, the kid with his old yacht, and which, belying the name, they were 50 foot or so long. He sailed and cherished her avidly. And I think a metaphor for Derek is the day that in a race the rudder fell off. Out in the lake, boom, down goes. How do we steer? I think Ralph Gilbert may have had some part of this. They might have lost their way, but with good teamwork, they steered the boat on the required course entirely by adjusting the sails. Many others would have deviated all over the place. Not Derek, straight as a die. On retirement, he returned to golf and accomplished that which many desire, but few attain, a hole in one, in which he took great pride. He then took an interest in architecture and went round, visit to Britain, photographing cathedrals. For a guy with almost no interest in religion, this was a remarkable thing. The buildings were everything. And he gave talks, nice talks about it. Then we got an interest in locks and canals. And we got talks about locks and canals. However, his last years were difficult, but faced with equanimity. He and Anne moved into a retirement home where for some years he took remarkable care of his wife, who was ailing quite significantly. He was totally devoted to her, and when she died, he never recovered. Rest well, good friends. You'll be long remembered.
Thank you very much, Peter. We now invite anyone who would like to say something about either Anne or Derek. I see a hand up. I see Ruth is standing up. So Ruth, please come up and say some words. So everyone is invited in turn. We'll even adjust the height of the microphone as needed. Thank you.
My name is Ruth Weisbrod, and I was a colleague of Anne Birt's at Baycrest Hospital, where we became good friends and remained so for many, many years after we both retired. I was the social worker on a floor where Anne was the attending physician, where she was very much respected and admired by all the patients and their families, and very, very much loved by all the staff. We all felt very lucky and privileged to be working with her. Dr. Anne Birt was old school. She was the kind of family physician that one doesn't see very often these days. She was very dedicated to her work. She was always kind and soft-spoken. And I think for Anne, being a doctor wasn't just a job, it was a calling, and she treated her work as such. She, as I said, she was kind and thoughtful, soft-spoken, was always on time for her meetings and appointments, always talked to everybody with respect and dignity. And in all the time I worked with her, I never ever heard Anne speak harshly to anybody or in anger. She was a very dignified and proper British lady, but that rather staid facade was misleading because beneath that exterior was a pretty sharp wit and sometimes a very, very wicked sense of humor. And she was no prude. There was nothing that was taboo or off topic for her. You could say anything and everything to our beloved Anne, and we often did. She was very, very proud of her 2 children, and I know she was very delighted when her beloved Emily, her granddaughter, came along, and she never tired of talking about her to me. I have very many memories of Anne Birt, but 2 stand out for me. The first is the day a code was called on one of our patients. And when I rushed into the room, there was petite Dr. Birt on top of the bed. And to this day, I've never quite figured out how she managed to get up there. She obviously was a lot stronger than she looked. Well, she was on top of the bed, astride this elderly gentleman doing very vigorous chest compressions on him, which seemed to me to take hours, but of course it wasn't that long. And she was successful, for he was resuscitated, and although he only lived for 2 more days, perhaps at 102 years of age, 2 more days of life was significant. And I think that Anne was secretly very pleased with her accomplishment. The other memory I have is when Anne was going to retire from Baycrest Hospital, and the staff organized going away lunch for her, and of course we took up a contribution to buy her a gift. I don't remember what we bought her, but what I do remember is that Anne walked in that day with a large parcel in hand, which contained either a toaster oven or a sandwich maker, I can't remember which, so that the staff could have a snack and a warm lunch in the staff room. And that was typically Anne, always thinking about others before herself. Well, our dear Anne Birt is no longer with us, but for those of us who valued her and cared about her, she will never be forgotten, for she was a very, very special woman and one that was truly, truly memorable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. David Kavlovic, I saw your hand go up when I opened the floor.
He's going to promote his radio show.
My name is David Kavlovic, and I have known Peter and Katie and their wonderful parents since 1971. So I've known them for 53 years. I want to, oh, can you hear me now? There's that bad. I really would want to attest to the humanity and love of your parents. I still remember my very first visit to your house, and it was an embarrassing situation for me, which I don't think Peter remembers, but I do. We were playing in the backyard, and I was having so much fun, I was ignoring the fact that I had to go to the bathroom. Until it was almost too late, I rushed in, went to the bathroom, and didn't make it. I felt so embarrassed and was crying. And the next thing I knew, Anne was giving me a huge and warm hug. To not feel embarrassed, to not feel ashamed, this is something that happens. From that moment on, I think I was a member of that family as well. Over the years, Peter and I became very, very close friends. I think it was pretty established even when we were 7 years old, because also of our mutual love of classical music. And I think that that's something that the Birts were grateful that I had this great love. It was actually my career for many years. And I must say that it's because of the influences of your parents that I had developed and fostered a love of record collecting. Many, many years in the late 70s when they would go off on their vacations, I was actually left in charge, believe it or not, of looking after the house. That had stayed standing when there was a 13, 14, 15-year-old in place. I would feed the cat, and of course I would make use of the record player, which I was immensely envious of, because even in its day, the Birt's record player was, if anybody remembers it, was a model known as a Gerard transcription player. Even in its day, it was coveted by record collectors and lovers of audio equipment, because not only could it play the 4 speeds at the time, 16, 33, 45, and 78, but it was also, the reason it was called a transcription player is with the proper arm, which your parents didn't have, that wasn't really the point, but with the proper arm, it could play 16-inch LPs, which was standard broadcast discs from the period, and Brits love collecting recordings. So you could find 16-inch transcription discs, and so I often played discs, and I was often paid in records. In fact, I remember one year after a visit to Britain, they came back with a wonderful box set of the early recordings of Sir Thomas Beecham for me, which was wonderful. I do remember your visit, David, in 1978, because we had gone on a Cook's tour, going around looking at the architecture of Toronto. And I remember we were under the Gardiner Expressway, and you looked up and you were looking at it, and you were saying, and at that time he was only about 12 years old, you were saying, this is going to start falling down. And we were all, how did he know that? How does he see that? We couldn't see anything. 5 years later, the first chunk started coming down. And I've never forgotten that you had seen where the problems were, I guess. You figured about salt buildup or whatever. Toronto's very bad with road salt. But especially because of Peter and Catherine's parents, I continued in my own pursuit and love of music. Of course, there were other family friends who were like that as well, but particularly the Birts and their love of opera. So after I had gone to university, I got my degree in musicology at the University of Toronto. Lo and behold, a couple of years later, I end up as an associate producer of music at CBC, working for 5 years on Saturday afternoon at the opera. And a number of recordings of a number of performances of the Canadian Opera Company that they had attended that period too, I had recorded. And because I was junior staff, I was the one who was forced to babysit the Saturday broadcast from the Met as it was being done live from the Metropolitan Opera, and then handed over to the local stations, in our case, the CBC, to finish broadcast at 6 o'clock. So I don't think I would have even been able to look after that show if I hadn't fostered a love of opera through the Birts, because a lot of classical musicians don't actually like opera. It's a truism, and it's a genre that does not appeal to everybody. Although, at the time, CBC's Saturday Afternoon at the Opera was the most listened to show on the CBC. I have 2 particular memories of listening to music with the Birts, which I used to love to do. I would bring over records, and we would listen. One time I had brought over a recording of a Divertimento by Leopold Mozart, who was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's father. It was a musical sleigh ride, or Schlittenfahrt in German. And this particular recording went overboard in interpretation. There were recordings of sleigh bells, but also of neighing and braying horses throughout the composition. When the piece ended, Derek said, "Will the other side be less agricultural?" The other memory, because it's a perfect memory of the Birts in their house, if you all recall, looking towards the garden. Anne always sat on the left, Derek always sat on the right in their lovely chairs. I had at this time brought over a recording of Mahler's Symphony No. 6, which concludes with an absolutely huge wallop on a specially built snare drum that has to be hit with a hammer. Even if you're familiar with the work, it still scares the crap out of people because it comes after a quiet passage. Well, as we were listening and as we were getting to the final movement, Derek, as often is the case, fell asleep in his chair. And I was just watching, I hadn't said anything to Peter or Katie, and I was just watching, waiting to see the reaction. And the flop occurred, and Derek literally fell out of his chair. Those are two of the great memories I remember. But thanks to the Birts, they had instilled in me as well, they've instilled in their children, a sense of humanity and caring for the world. If you think that you're not measuring up necessarily to your parents, have no fear. You do. You were the apple of their eye. There was no question about that. And their love and the love that they gave you was very clear. And of all the parents that I knew, these were the ones who were very important to me. And it's great to see their legacy passed on into other generations. Thank you.
We are getting fairly close to the end of our time allotment. Is there anyone else who wanted to say? I think Ralph had a memory or two. I wouldn't want to miss a word.
So I'm Ralph Gilbert. I'm a head and neck surgeon and was Derek's partner in head and neck surgery at Sunnybrook from 1988 until 2001. He called me a deserter when I moved to University Health Network, but we were very close friends. So I first met Derek in 1983 when he was doing work on his triological thesis. So for those of you that are not in the ENT surgery field, this is a thesis to enter into an American-Canadian society. And Derek did some amazing work describing how certain types of voice box cancers can grow. And it was a major contribution. And I was impressed at that time by how thorough he was, the breadth of his knowledge in medicine, which I'm sure everybody here who's seen him at work knows. He was absolutely amazing as a clinician. As I went into training, Derek became my mentor, my teacher, a valued colleague, and a remarkable friend. And I think everybody who has worked with Derek has the same perspective on how he dealt with them. So a little bit of, I'm not known for telling jokes or funny stories, but I think my favorite one is I remember when I was in training, Gene Davidson might remember this, my first rotation at Sunnybrook in head and neck surgery, I had done a fair bit of head and neck surgery and had views about my skill set, which were probably a little bit personally overvalued. And so Derek was doing a neck dissection, which is an operation for head and neck cancer. And he said, I'm going to show you how I do this operation. So I watched him do it. And then there was another one right after it. And I turned to him and I said, would you mind if I show you how I do this operation? So at that point, for most surgeons, and if somebody said that to me now, I would say, you can leave the room right now because you're done. But Derek had this, as was just described, this amazing ability to listen, to care, to allow the trainees and the people he was responsible for to develop in their profession. And he mentored me by allowing me to do what I was trying to do. When I finished training, did a fellowship in Sweden, and then came back to join the Sunnybrook family, and Julian's here as well. It was an amazing partnership. So I had trained in a specialty or a subspecialty called reconstructive microsurgery, where you transplant parts of the body in to replace the missing parts. And no ear, nose, and throat surgeon had done these operations in Canada, so I was the first one. And imagine a colleague who would have you treat their own patient, support you and mentor you, and allow you to develop your career. And subsequent to that, we've gone on both through the Sunnybrook family and through my UHN family, to develop virtually every major head and neck surgeon in this country. And it's all directly related to Derek. Derek and I shared a shared passion for sailing, and you heard Peter Alberti allude to an event where the rudder stopped working. I don't think it fell completely off, but did it fall right off? Yeah. And we did steer with the sails, if I recall. And I was both a tactician and a crew member with Derek in the 8-meter worlds and sailed a number of times with him. For those of you that know anything about sailing, Derek was famous for one thing: pinching. And I think anybody who sailed with him and was his tactician was, Derek, will you stop pinching? You're slowing the boat down. But he would take that as well as anybody could, and was an amazing person to sail with. And you've seen the pictures of the champagne on the side of the boat. I think that's probably sail past, is it?
Yep.
I think we did the same thing at the 8-meter worlds a number of times. So it was always incredibly entertaining. And then we both developed an interest in golf, and he and I shared that interest. Peter Alberti alluded to the fact that he was the program director for the ENT department. And he's exactly right, because every trainee who worked under him respected him, valued his judgment about where their skill sets were, and Derek took incredible pride in the people he trained. It was really amazing to see it. Individual trainees who were struggling were mentored. They were dealt with fairly, thoughtfully, and carefully. And as I said, I think he's made an incredible contribution to ear, nose, and throat surgery in this country and internationally. I brought this thing along, which, for those of you that don't know much about, this is somebody's jaw, believe it or not. And Derek and I had an interest in a particular operation that was called a mandibular swing. And so this is the jaws is the mandible. This is a mandibular swing. And there is. No. No. Do you know what it said? Okay. So Derek went through a phase where he was making things out of wood. I think he made a chair for the Canadian Society, and he made something for UNET, I think, and he made this one for me, and he said, you have to figure out what these letters mean. And I got the first line. It says, conceived and created by Derek Birt for Ralph Gilbert, and then I can't get the rest of it. But this is interesting because he and I worked, this is emblematic of how we worked in head and neck surgery. He and I did work on how to actually repair jaws. And then within it, you can see there's a shackle, which goes along with the sailing theme. And within it, you can see a loonie. And we had a tradition when I would reconstruct one of Derek's patients that at the end of the operation, he'd go home for dinner because often we would finish late. He'd come back and give me a loonie so I could go and buy a soft drink from the pop machine in the operating room. And he did it after every single operation. So Derek and Anne are likely the finest people I've met in my life and had the privilege to know. And I'm sure everybody who worked with Derek as part of the Sunnybrook family feels the same way. Incredible love, admiration, and respect. Thank you for the honor.
The final words of this afternoon have to be given by Emily. So.
Hi everyone, so I'm their granddaughter, as you might know. I'm not really one for speeches, so I'll just try and keep this short and sweet. My grandparents were always super kind to me. I remember whenever I came down to Toronto for the holidays, I would wait in the living room at my aunt's house, and then whenever they came in through the front door, I would go and run into their arms. And yeah, they spoiled me really badly. They let me have ice cream for breakfast one time, so that was really nice of them. Yeah, my grandmother, she always called me darling, and my grandfather, he bought me Skittles all the time, every time I visited, because one Christmas I got a giant bag of Skittles and I shared them with him, and he liked them a lot. So yeah, he always made sure to buy me a bag of Skittles so that we could share them together. Yeah, they loved me a lot. I definitely felt how much they loved me, and yeah, I'll never forget them. So thank you.
Sadly, we have a few tributes from people who sent them in by email, but I think we've used our time allotment. We would like, in the spirit of non-wastefulness, for someone at each table to claim the bouquet and take it home. And if you can scoop up any of the nibbles outside, please do so. A few of us are going down to the boat, so we're not going to leave them in the car in the hot sun. I would personally like to thank everyone who came. I appreciate your kind words, your emails, your comments, and your presence and support here today. This is the end of an era for the family, and thank you for coming to share it with us.
Thank you all for coming. This has been a very important day for us. Thank you all for being here and for sharing this with us. Thank you.